Great. We are now recording. Okay, wonderful. So again, thanks for joining us today for the 5 pillars of equitably grading English learners. And I see we have people from all over the country, and even a few Canadian friends are joining us as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with a poll to find out how you heard about this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our poll, which hopefully you can see on your screen right now. And so did you hear about this webinar from Twitter, Facebook, Colorín Colorado, from an email, maybe from the Encela website, from a colleague, or from another way? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to go ahead and complete the poll. Right now, it looks like email and a colleague are in the lead. And I'll just give you another few seconds. Right now, we've got about 226 people on with us live, which is really amazing. So I'll go ahead and end our poll, and I will share the results with you. Hopefully you can see where you heard about our webinar. So most of you through an email and then through a colleague. A few heard from Twitter, and just a couple from Facebook or from another way. So great, thanks so much for joining us and figuring out this polling feature. And so now that we've started with a poll, I want to show you a little bit about our online platform, which is called Zoom, in case you're not familiar with it. So go ahead and take a minute to find your control bar, which is visible to you if you've downloaded Zoom. So we'll be pausing a couple of times for content-related questions, and you'll use the Q&A button to ask those kinds of questions. You can also enter a content-related question whenever you have one. And also, if you happen to experience any technical difficulties or just want to comment on something, please use the chat button to let us know. And you've been chatting all along and saying where you're from, so I think you're pretty familiar with that. And so you can also use the chat button to connect with each other and comment on the webinar. So great, and let's begin. So I want to share with you our agenda. So we're going to start off with our welcome and talk a little bit about why are we focusing on grading English learners. And then Larry Ferlazzo is going to take over his presentation with the chat. Then we'll do a Q&A, question and answer related to Larry's section. And then I'll share with you my piece, and we'll have some chats as well. We'll have a general Q&A and then a wrap up. And like I shared with you earlier, we're recording this webinar, and tomorrow we're going to send out a link to everyone who's registered, and we'll give you a link to this download of the webinar so you can go ahead and replay it with your colleagues. And so also today, we've shared with you in your welcome email that you received today a handout from our Contents of a Webinar handout that we'd like to give to you. So at Support Ed, we really like to provide you with practical tools that you can use in your context. And again, we've shared this link to the handout with you, and we hope you'll share these practical tools with your colleagues. So who is presenting today? So I'm Diane Stair-Fenner. I'm here starting out. I'm the president of a woman-owned small business based here in Fairfax, Virginia, outside the Washington, D.C. area. And I've also written 4 books on English learner education. I'm a former ESOL teacher, and I spent the majority of my time in Fairfax County Public Schools, Virginia. And my colleague and friend Larry Ferlazzo is a high school ELL teacher, and he's also a pretty well-known author, New York Times contributor, and he also writes for Education Week. You may have heard of Larry, I suspect. He's very, very well-known in our field, and I'm just kidding, being facetious. He's a wonderful contributor to the field of English learner education. I'm so thrilled to have him here with me today. So, we want to start off by sharing, why are we focusing on EL grading? So when my group, Support Ed, we were asked to create a professional development session on grading English learners. And we thought this would be a pretty straightforward task. But once we started researching this topic, we found out there were very limited resources specifically for English learners. We reached out to our online professional learning network, including on Colorín Colorado's Facebook group and Twitter. and also the Advocating for L's group on Facebook. And here's my tweet that I sent out, and we saw that people's responses made it really clear that this is an area that many of us face challenges in, and we can use some more resources. And you may be hopefully familiar with the Colorín Colorado website. And so my colleagues, Jill Kester, Sydney Snyder, and I wrote a blog post on Colorín Colorado about grading L's. And I'll go more in depth on the 5 pillars that we wrote about in this blog post in my section of today's presentation. And you can find a link to this blog post on your Padlet. Also, Larry Ferlazzo and Katie Hull-Hypniski wrote a blog post on the topic as well, and you can find a link to their blog post on our shared Padlet too, and I'll be referring to the Padlet in a bit. And next, we have Larry Ferlazzo coming up with his presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who will remember to unmute his microphone, and he'll walk you through some considerations for grading L's and get your input. Here you go, Larry.
Great. Well, thanks, Diane. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So if I could get some indication on the, yep, great. Sounds like at least some people can hear me. Great. Well, first I'd like to thank Diane for inviting me to participate today. Even though for some reason she decided to have me start off the webinar, this is really her show and I'm a tag along. And I want to give a little info about myself. I've been teaching English language learners and international baccalaureate and mainstream students at Luther Burbank High School in Sacramento for the past 15 years. Prior to becoming a teacher, I was a community organizer for 19 years. Both my parents are immigrants, and in fact, my father taught ESL to adults. Our school has about 1,700 students, and 500 of them are considered ELLs. And as Diane mentioned, in addition to teaching, I do a lot of writing. As I say in our annual family newsletter, I'm a prolific writer of books that aren't on anyone's bestseller lists. Katie Hull and I have a new book coming out next month titled The ELL Teacher's Toolbox. It's my 4th on teaching ELLs. It's the 3rd that Katie and I have written together. I've written some other books on student motivation, parent engagement, and classroom management. And as Diane said, I write a weekly teacher advice column for Ed Week and regular posts for the New York Times on teaching ELLs. I also play basketball regularly. And for 1 week this year, my team actually had reached a 500 record before we went back to our usual pattern of losing. But the motto on our uniform says it's only a game. So that's a little bit about myself. Also, before I go on, I want to emphasize that though I'm going to share a few of my thoughts and Katie Hull's thoughts on grading today, I am actually far more interested in hearing what you all have to say about it. And there'll be a couple of times that I'll be explicitly asking for everybody to share their thoughts in the chat window. I believe Diane will put your responses together and re-share it out, and I'll certainly be blogging about it. So first, my overall perspective on grading. Well, first, I should mention that grading is typically just not much of an issue in my classroom or Katie's classroom. We know there's a lot of angst about it in a lot of different classrooms, but we sometimes are a little perplexed by it. We view grades as just information and as a form of communication, but also the lowest form of communication. It's, as Rick Wormley says, they're not rewards or punishments. I guess if we look at the Latin roots of the word grades, it suggests that they are steps towards something. And that's okay, but we prefer to be focusing in on this idea of assessment, which again, the Latin root means to sit beside and to assist. Whereas a grade is just a letter, right? Continuous assessments, both teacher and student, planned and initiated, and reflections in their meeting provide directions to a student's journey where we can adjust, they can adjust, and we can adjust. And in an article on the Padlet that I added yesterday, there are links to both student and teacher assessments, both for, I use it with beginning English language learners and intermediate ELLs, that we use regularly so that students can self-assess and we can assess as well. And I think, you know, some people might say that we're easy graders, but I think the focus is that it's about encouraging students to self-reflect and develop intrinsic motivation. And our students do a very good job at moving up the line in terms of language tests and state assessments. This slide and the next slide is the official criteria that Katie and I and others developed for our district a few years ago for English language development classes. And just so you know, I teach a newcomers class, and this year I'm teaching an advanced beginners class. Often I teach intermediate English, but this year instead I'm teaching intermediates, world history, and US history. And I'm developing a support class for long-term ELLs next year as a pilot project. So I sort of teach the whole gamut. So this is sort of our official criteria, but we're flexible, right? This is the criteria that we show if anybody asks. But as with anything, we want to view our students as individuals and emphasize whatever works for our students, what will ever encourage them to move forward. In the self-assessments that we do for students, 90% of the time, I agree with the student's grade. 10% of the time, we don't and we meet. But I'd say a good portion of that 10% is when students have actually lowballed themselves. So that is, you know, I think you can sort of see how we grade in our ELD classes. And what I am interested in now in hearing in the chat window, how do you handle in your grading in your ESL or ELD only classes? We're not talking about grading ELLs in mainstream classes right now. That's going to be the next one. So please take a couple of minutes and write in the chat what guides your grading with your English language learners in your ELD classes. And if you have any written materials or links that you can either add or upload to the Padlet, that would be great for everybody. I'm shocked that district does not have, some of your districts don't have an official policy. I'm being facetious. Great. We'll spend a few more seconds on having people share your thoughts and your experience. Okay, we'll keep on doing it. We're going to move on to the next part, grading ELLs in non-ELD classes, which I know is a spark point, at least in my school, and I'm assuming in other schools. Actually, on Wednesday, I'm leading a discussion of that among our own faculty. So again, this is tricky. And our district does not offer any grading guidance to mainstream teachers who have ELLs in their classes, though we hope that'll change in the future. And to our best knowledge, our state of California, you'd think if any state would have guidance about that, California would, also does not provide guidance in that area. If they do, and somebody out there knows, I'd love to hear it, but we can't find any guidance about that. But based on what we have found, what Katie and I have found, I'm going to share what we have learned, particularly for middle and high schools. That there's, again, as Diane was saying, there's not an enormous amount of information on that. But based on what we found, the districts and states that do have specific grading policies for ELLs and mainstream classes appear in various degrees to have some key points in common. And they're particularly two. One, it's the responsibility of the teacher to make content and assessments comprehensible to ELLs. And I want to emphasize to make all content and assessments comprehensible to ELLs. And no student should be retained because of English language challenges. So those are sort of the two universals that we've seen from our research on the districts and states that do have policies. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is that these policies point out the difference between being equal and being fair. And they make it clear that treating ELLs equally by treating them the same as English proficient students is not fair and could even be unlawful. Federal guidelines make it very clear that it's the responsibility of high schools to create a pathway for a student who enters high school as a beginner to be able to graduate in 4 years, right? And for all of you, that's particularly challenging since it takes 4 to 7 years to gain proficiency in academic English. And they must graduate with the prerequisites to enter college. We can't really see how that is possible without a system of differentiated instruction and differentiated grading for ELLs in our schools. And the federal government also provides very clear instructions that accommodations on state assessments have to be made by states on any assessments administered to ELLs. Those guidelines only focus on those guidelines only focus on state assessments, but it doesn't appear to be that much of a stretch to say that teachers should follow that in their own classes too. I spent 19 years as a community organizer prior to becoming a teacher, and I learned we have this adage that, and actually I see a comment, do you have a reference for the federal guidance? Yes, in the article in the Padlet that Katie and I wrote has lots of links, including a link to that federal guidance. That in organizing, we view the world as it is, as opposed to the way we'd like it to be. And in the world as it is, the reality is many teachers are not going to make all of their content and evaluations and assessments accessible to ELLs because they don't know how, because they're extremely busy, for whatever reason. Given that, I don't really know how it is just to not do some kind of differentiated grading. I want to take a little time now, shorter period of time than we did for the last one, is to please share in the chat How does your district, school, or state handle grading of ELLs in mainstream classes? Are you one of the few that seem to have guidelines or advice? Please share now. It's a sad chat, what I'm seeing. And if you have district guidelines, I hope that you share them on the Padlet. So the primary way I'd like to end my part is we just want teachers and encourage teachers to show compassion and support when it comes to giving a lettered grade to ELLs. And hopefully mainstream teachers will reflect on how they would want their children if they were in a new culture, in a new country, in a new language treated. So now, questions. Let's see. So one question is, Diane, how are we gonna handle questions? Do you want me to?
Right, yeah, so this is Diane again. There are a couple of questions coming in. So now if you'd like to ask a couple of content-specific questions, and the nice feature about Q&A is we can see each question coming in individually, and the chat just kind of scrolls really quickly. So I'll read a couple of questions, Larry, that we've gotten. One is there any way you can share more information about the class you're developing for long-term Ls? And okay, so that's one question. Go ahead.
Sure. Yes. In fact, on my blog, there is a best list on resources for how to work with long-term English language learners. And you will see a link to a post there where I share the preliminary curriculum. It's just very preliminary. And I will be writing a lot more about that. We're actually going to have a control group of 30 long-term ELLs who will not be in my support class. This will be in addition to their regular English class. And we'll be doing common assessments and seeing if how we're doing works. But I'll be writing lots about it and have begun. So, and I'm always eager to hear if anyone else has had experience, good or bad, with working with that kind of support class.
Great, and we might have time for just one or two more. Rasha asks, I'm really interested in knowing if there is work on the federal government changing its policy on graduation for Ls who arrive in 9th grade as newcomers.
There may very well be, but that hasn't been made public yet, that the existing guideline, which is linked to in the article that Katie and I wrote, makes it very clear. I mean, that's almost like the wording I use was almost a quote from them. They make it very clear that if you come in as a beginner in 9th grade, it's the responsibility of the high school to ensure that you can graduate college ready 4 years later.
Great, and we'll go for one more question from Francis Guzman asked, how should long-term Ls be graded? How should long-term Ls be graded?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think in the same way, we should be looking with flexible eyes on all of our students who have specific challenges. We should treat long-term ELLs the same way. And one would hope that districts or states would provide that kind of guidance. But obviously from the chat and from our experience, they don't. So I guess it's up to us.
It's totally up to us. So thank you so much, Larry. Larry's going to be staying with us as we move to the next piece here, and we'll come back together at the end to answer more questions. So as your questions do come up, please keep typing them in the Q&A, and like Larry mentioned, we're compiling all of these questions too, and we can share them with you at the end. So I'm going to be sharing some more insights on equitably grading English learners, and I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction. And here you'll notice that you have an icon, looks like a little piece of paper at the bottom right corner of your screen, and that indicates that this information is in your handout that you were emailed today, and you can also access it through our website. Tomorrow we'll send everyone out an email that will also have a link to the handout. So this is the first resource in your handout, and it's an opinionaire we created about grading English learners. And it's a way to gauge how people are feeling on the topic, including you and your colleagues. We encourage you to share this opinionaire with your colleagues and administrators if you're doing your own professional development, or maybe you have your own PLC on grading. And we hope that you'll take this topic and really share it and get these conversations going. So remember in the beginning of the presentation how I mentioned that a lot of people responded to our outreach on Facebook and Twitter. Here are some of their responses, and these might resonate with you in terms of grading. So these are some common grading challenges. Some wrote that, I have to give a single score, and that can't really provide real information about learning or growth. Some had an exemption period, and they said that isn't long enough. Some mentioned insufficient accommodations. Some respondents said that their English learners maybe had some unidentified learning issues. Some share that fairness doesn't mean equal in terms of grading English learners. Some said that grades are not an accurate measure of what English learners can do. Some said that in grading for mastery, they weren't sure where to separate content and language. Some respondents said that the focus is on non-essential matters. And one wrote about creep, which is reading and writing creep. That means when the English learner's reading and writing skills impact or creep into the content results in grading. Some said that they didn't have an opportunity to assess content in the home language, or L1. And finally, some said that differentiation happens in instruction, but it's not carried over to assessment. And so we came up with this new framework called the 5 Pillars of Equitable EL Grading that I'll share with you next. And you can also read about it more in depth on the Colorín Colorado blog post that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. And so here's a visual of our EL grading framework. And we drew from our colleagues' challenges. We conducted a review of some of the literature around EL grading, and then we synthesized some best practices that we found in the field to create this framework for equitable EL grading. So here's just a quick overview of each of the pillars, and then I'll go into a little more detail on the subcomponents of each pillar. And be thinking about which one really stands out the most to you. We're going to talk about it in the chat a little bit. So pillar 1 is define the content and language standards. Pillar 2 is incorporate scaffolding to support ELs in achieving the standards. Pillar 3 is assess ELs progress fairly. Oh, I'm sorry. Pillar 4 is assess ELs progress fairly. And pillar 5 is involve ELs, family, and colleagues. And I may have skipped pillar 3, which is support ELs progress towards mastery. So let's look at pillar 1, which is define the content and language standards. So in setting up a system in which ELs can be graded fairly, we first need to define which content as well as language standards they would like their students to meet. And as many of you are ESOL teachers, and this is what we do, right? But this really needs to also carry over to content teachers. So it's up to us to spread the word if you're not a content teacher. So hand in hand with these two sets of standards also go content and language learning objectives for ELs based on these standards. So we recommend that teachers share content and language learning objective with ELs using student-friendly versions to the degree possible. Also, we recommend that teachers identify success criteria for ELs in meeting the objectives, and that they share models of strong work samples with ELs so they're aware of teachers' expectations. And also, model work samples should include models produced by ELs at different levels of proficiency, so our English learners can see themselves reflected in exemplary student work, and this is so important. Pillar 2 is incorporate scaffolding to support ELs in achieving the standards. So depending on their level of English proficiency, most ELs will not be able to access grade level content standards without appropriate scaffolding from their teachers. We recommend using 3 types of scaffolds in the areas of materials, instruction, and strategic grouping of students to work toward removing linguistic barriers for ELs. In implementing scaffolds, we recommend you do so based on EL's English language proficiency level, as well as individual EL strengths and needs, and also on the demands of that particular lesson. Also, we recommend that teachers set expectations with students for the gradual removing of scaffolding as appropriate. ELs should be aware that scaffolds are temporary and will be removed as they gain language proficiency and content knowledge and skills. And also, we also stress that it's really crucial for ESOL and content teachers to collaborate to determine appropriate scaffolds for their ELs to meaningfully access content. And so here's another, on our handout, we're sharing another resource with you, which is sample scaffolds by category. And this is from my book with my co-author, Sydney Snyder, Unlocking English Learners' Potential. So if you or your colleagues might like some more guidance around scaffolds for ELs by category, see the second document that we're including in your handout. So pillar 3 is support ELs' progress toward mastery. We believe that grades should not be used punitively for any students, and especially not for ELs who are already more inclined to drop out of school than non-English learners. So we suggest providing ELs sufficient time and opportunities for learning, such as offering a lunch bunch and/or after-school opportunities to do schoolwork with guidance from teachers, tutors, or peers, for example. And maybe you have some more suggestions. Please note them in the chat. Also, we recommend focusing on ELs' progress towards mastery as well as their achievement. It's important to stress that we're evaluating ELs' progress towards mastery, not just whether they've mastered the objective or not. In spite of careful scaffolding, all grade level standards may not always be 100% achievable for certain ELs. It might be more motivating for an EL to recognize his or her progress than to see an achievement score by itself. Also, since a lot of ELs have responsibilities such as work and taking care of siblings outside of school, they might not be able to complete all assignments perfectly on time. So because of that, we recommend allowing ELs to turn in some work late without a penalty if they communicate with the teacher about the unique circumstances ahead of time. Also, late work might be a sign that an EL needs some more support to be able to access the content, understand directions about what they're supposed to do, and/or complete the task. And also, if you give homework, and not everyone does, we recommend using homework as an opportunity for non-graded practice. So pillar 4 is assess ELs' progress equitably. So in order to equitably assess ELs, teachers need to design assessments and supports that allow ELs to access and demonstrate mastery of content and/or language objectives. To equitably assess ELs' progress, it's really critical to also scaffold assessments, not just instruction for ELs, based on individual EL strengths and needs. For example, depending on an EL's level of English proficiency, you could provide that student sentence frames, images, or a word bank to lighten the linguistic load of the assessment. So in that way, the student can show a more valid picture of what he or she knows and can do in a content area. During instruction, ELs should also have ample classroom opportunity to practice with any scaffold that they'll be seeing during an assessment. And another aspect of equitably assessing ELs' progress comes in the form of group work. How many of you do group work? Maybe you can chat, let us know in the chat. We recommend strategically grouping ELs as a form of scaffolding instruction. But for grading group work, we really recommend assigning individual scores instead of just a group grade to students. including L's. And so in this way, individual students aren't penalized if all the students aren't contributing equally to a particular group or project, or maybe if it's not scaffolded as well for English learners. So that's also something to consider. And pillar 5, which is involve L's, families, and colleagues. So while this is the last pillar, pillar 5 supports all the other pillars. We've often found that L's and their families don't really have a full understanding of grade level expectations, how grades are given, and what each section of a report card means. How many of you find that as well, that L's and their families really don't have a full understanding of grading? Share about that in the chat if you'd like. We advocate for explaining grade level expectations, the grading process, and report cards to L's in their home language whenever possible. And it also, we believe that L's and their families should be involved in the entire grading process, beginning the school year or whenever they enroll in school, with an overview of what the grading expectations and processes look like. And these meetings are also a good time for L's and their families to set goals for their learning. And also, a concluding thoughts that while, collaboration and co-teaching have been on a lot of teachers' radar for some time, co-grading may not yet be. And so we'd like to get that word out there. We strongly recommend that ESOL and content teachers co-grade, not just co-plan and co-teach, but co-grade, collaborating to assign grades to L's on formative and summative assessments, as well as to discuss final grades on report cards. By doing so, by co-grading, the level of collaboration will increase and strengthen, and all teachers can leverage their expertise when it comes to L's. We know that there's a lot of expertise out there in the field. And so I've just shared a lot of information with you, so turn to the chat and tell us which pillar do you think is the most important of the pillars we discussed. So defining the content and language standards, that's pillar 1. Pillar 2 is incorporating scaffolding. Pillar 3 is supporting progress towards mastery. Pillar 4 is assessing L's progress equitably. And pillar 5 is involving L's, families, and colleagues. And so I'm seeing all of them together, but I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat and seeing a lot of pillar 2 and 3, scaffolding. And so we'll compile these results at the end of our webinar. So thanks for sharing so far in the chat what's been the most important to you so far. And I'd like to point out the last document you have in your handout, which is the Equitable L grading checklist. And I really encourage you to share this grading tool with your colleagues to start getting this conversation going. So you can use this handout to have colleagues and yourself reflect on how well your school or district is operating from the 5 pillars framework. And then collaboratively, you can decide on areas you might wish to focus on to more equitably grade your English learners. So we really encourage you to take a look at this document. And now we'll go back to the general Q&A button, and please use the Q&A feature to ask any remaining questions. So do you have any questions or comments or suggestions about equitably grading L's? And Larry and I can answer some of these for you, and I'll read out a few for him. And also, as you're doing this, please share your takeaways and resources on our Padlet. And we've been, my colleague Kate and I, and maybe some other colleagues have been entering it in the chat. So it's bit.ly/EL5pillars chat. You can access the Padlet directly that way. So we're gonna turn to the Q&A, and I will show you just as we're doing that, this is what our Padlet looked like before we started. And to enter a resource or share your takeaways, you would click on the bottom right-hand corner on that little pink plus. So I'm gonna open up the Q&A and ask some questions.
Diane?
Yeah, go ahead.
I know both in the chat and the Q&A, people have been talking about how to handle homework when parents don't speak English. And I was suggesting there are lots of great sites for people who have online access either through their phone or through a computer that offer great examples of practice for ELLs. I have a best list of for homework sites for English language learners in my blog that I have my students use. So that's I just wanted to put that out, that that's a fairly easy way if people have access. Of course, access it's less of a problem than it has been in the past, but it can still be a challenge for many of our families.
Great, and maybe Larry, you could share that on the Padlet, that particular blog post, so we could see those resources. That'd be wonderful.
Sure, with a reminder, that would
We can
certainly I can do that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so there are lots of different questions coming in. So one participant, Casey, asks, what should teachers or schools do when their state doesn't test L's in their native language in order to determine if that child has a learning disability? And I can start, talking about that in Fairfax County, and I'll share a resource. I'm making a note on the Padlet as well from the Virginia Department of Education. So in Fairfax County, we had a group of dual language assessment teachers, and I was one of them, who would work with schools and work with, we call them local screening committees, when students have been referred for special ed, to give formative assessments in both the home language and in English, to get a sense of where the student was stronger and which language they were stronger, and also to do some detective work on their background, to see what their narrative was, what their educational history was, to look at scaffolding being done in the classroom, to talk with teachers, to look at transcripts, just to provide some more data points. And that's my biggest recommendation, is to collaborate with all different teachers involved in students where you might suspect a disability, and to really examine all of the data that's available to you. So I'll share a guide that the Virginia Department of Education put together that you might find helpful. So some districts we're working with currently have found it to be very helpful. And so we'll look at some more questions.
Maybe if I could chime in on that. I think that's a great question. And to speak bluntly, in many of those situations, I don't know what the hell we can do. Because I know for our school, which is very attentive to ELLs, and I'm sure this is reflective of many others, oftentimes special ed staff will say we want to wait a year, because up until that time we can't tell if the challenge is language or learning disability. And then there's the whole issue of getting assessments being able to be done by a psychologist in the home language of the student. I mean, it's a real mess. I'm certainly eager, if there are districts that think you do a very effective job of providing ELLs with special needs, both with assessment and follow-up support, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, and speaking of a question of, do you have any examples? I'm going to look at another question. Someone asked, do you have examples of districts where secondary teachers are given common planning time to co-plan, co-teach, and co-grade? How is it funded and sustained? And yeah, Larry, you can be thinking of that, but there's a school in Fairfax County, Virginia, and I can share some video on it that we filmed for Colorín Colorado with support from the NEA, the National Education Association. And it's called Mason Crest Elementary School. This isn't secondary, this is elementary, where they have a phenomenal co-planning and co-teaching model where they're getting together, they're planning every day, they're meeting all of their requirements for instructional hours and instructional time, but they are really focused on this collaboration piece, which it definitely stands out. And I can share information on that. Larry, I don't know if you have any information as well.
Well, our school is divided into 6 small learning communities with about 300 to 400 students and the same, and 20, 25 teachers. And those 400 students stay with those 20 teachers throughout their high school career. And we meet as a small learning community once a week to do for common planning time for a variety of things. But it works really great on lots of levels because students don't get lost in the cracks because we see what's going on every day with students. And actually the small learning communities are geographically located to a large extent so that there's regular contact between those 20 or 30 teachers and those 300 to 400 students.
Thanks. And here's another question that goes hand in hand with co-planning and co-teaching. How do you handle or address teachers if you pull out and students may miss work?
Well, I don't teach in a pull-out situation, but I would suggest that the same comments that I made about how to deal with differentiated grading would apply here. That one, I don't know at what level we're talking about, what grade level we're talking about, but challenging teachers or having a conversation about teachers is that we've got to get these folks ready to graduate, to get through the 4 years. We want to show compassion. We want to be realistic. You know, how do we do this? And for our school, it really is very helpful is that our principal is providing some pretty strong guidance on this so that it's becoming more of an institutional buy-in.
Great. Thanks, Larry. And I'm going to take a couple more questions here. One is from my colleague Carrie in Ontario, and she asks, how do we support our mainstream colleagues in understanding equitable grading of L's as ESL professionals? And so I'd like to, to start by thinking of that and how do you get others to understand? And definitely the first piece is really raising that awareness, I would think. Take some of these tools or start some conversations and, let others know and have them come to the realization themselves that this is an issue. And I find it's more powerful when they do come to the realization themselves, and you can probably think of some creative ways to do that. And, think of ways you can advocate and show your leadership to really realize that equitable grading is just as important, if not more so, than equitable instruction. And have these conversations, and they might be tough conversations to have with others around grading English learners and how important that is. I don't know, Larry, do you have any suggestions as well?
Well, on Wednesday, I'm leading this discussion with our social science teachers, and in April, I'm leading 2 more discussions separately with math and science teachers. So I guess I'll have a little more advice to share after that time, and I'll certainly be writing about it. We had a good discussion. Our English language arts teachers got it fairly well. I mean, we had a discussion last month. The article that Katie and I wrote was used as a sort of a guideline for the discussion. And I think a lot of our teachers did not know that it is a federal civil rights requirement that we have to prepare our beginners to be able to graduate within 4 years. So, that's helpful for everybody to know.
Yeah, great. Jolene Bowser asks, does anyone have a template for an ELL report card? And Jolene, there is a link to one on the Padlet, and it has report cards. And this is a sample that an organization in New York State put together, and it has samples in probably at least 10 different languages. So you can take a look at that, but maybe others have some as well. And Iris asks, I think this is a question to you, Larry, where will the best list be posted?
I'm not sure about the homework. I mean, I'll post. I'm happy to post a homework link on the Padlet, and on my blog there's a big box that says best lists. So you'll find them all there as well.
Great. And let's see, Kim asks, what ways have you found that work best for taking this information to our fellow educators? And I can start by saying, tomorrow you'll get an email with a link to this recording. I encourage you to, and I'm sure Larry does too, take this recording, share it, view it as a group, talk about it, and you can determine what you might want to do with this information, and how you might want to move forward. And I would suggest, putting together an action plan. You can't tackle all of the areas of the pillars or any of the pieces that we've talked about. You can't do it all at once, but determine together what's the most important for you right now. Maybe what's the most important piece of what you want to change between now and the end of the year. And I would say to focus on that first, and you can also then start planning for the next academic year. Larry, do you have any other suggestions?
I think initiating a conversation with your colleagues is the best way to go. I know anytime somebody comes from the central office and shares ideas, nobody will really pay attention to them. But having a conversation, having a colleague begin to share their experience and their ideas, there's nothing that beats that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to just end with, we have time for just one more before we start sharing a couple of final resources with you. Monica asks, are there any sessions at TESOL in Chicago next week that you know of regarding this topic? I haven't looked. I was supposed to be there, but now I'm not going to be attending. But to any WIDA colleagues out there, we submitted a proposal on this topic for the WIDA conference in the fall. So in Detroit, hopefully we'll see. Maybe it'll get accepted. If so, I'll let you all know. Yeah, but we definitely need to keep talking about this topic. We completely agree. So thanks for those of you who have written all of these questions. You can keep typing them in. We'll compile them for you, and then Larry and I can talk about how we want to share them.
Thanks, everybody. I'm looking forward to looking over the chat list because there was a lot of good stuff there, and I'm expecting to learn a lot.
Yeah, thanks. And we just want to share a few more resources with you. I had referenced our book, Unlocking English Learners' Potential, where some of our resources in the handout come from. And so this is co-authored with Sydney Snyder, and we offer resources for scaffolding and assessing ELS, and it's all within a framework of equity, advocacy, and leadership that's so important for our students. And also, if you like this webinar, you like the interactive online format, you might be interested in our summer PD courses. They're 10 hours long. We have 4 of them going on this summer. We have a new one on strategies for building ELS academic language, also strategies for making content accessible, a SLIFE course, and an advocating for English learners course. So we hope you'll take a look at those. And also, if you want to keep the conversation going after our webinar concludes, we encourage you to like our Facebook page, our Support Ed Facebook page. So this is a way you can download it. And again, thank you so much, and thanks to Larry for joining me today, and for everybody who helped put this webinar together. If you have any questions for me personally, or I can get them to Larry as well, just send me an email, diane@getsupported.net. And just as a reminder, we'll send you a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow, and also another link to the Padlet and a link to the handout in case you missed any of those. So thanks everybody for your participation, for blowing up our chat room. We know that this is an area where we really need to devote some more time and energy and resources. So thanks for helping us get a conversation started.
Great. Have a good rest of the school year, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.